Chapter 8 of Betty Baird by Hamlin Weikel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Holly Jensen. Chapter 8 The Duel After All. Betty, you have only an hour to prepare for your Latin class. Do stop fiddling with those books and get at your lesson, pleaded Lois. Oh, don't bother me, Lois. I am putting these books of poetry together. Well, it seems very foolish of you to be so indifferent when you know how much depends on this first class. I heard the girls say last evening that Miriam was going around getting all the best Latin scholars in the school to help her prepare her lesson. Jessie Bentworth said you will look pretty foolish when you get up thinking you can read Virgil, and Miriam said, let's all snicker when she sits down. Let them snicker. Their snickering won't hurt anybody, said Betty lightly. I am going to dress now, for appearances count more than anything else here, she added rather bitterly. Hey ho! Well, since you say I must change my dress, I'll do so, though I think this black silk is good enough for anybody. No, you must put on that white piqué suit, and I am going to fix your hair. But just read your lesson over once, that's a dear, said Lois coaxingly. Oh, Lois, you bother me to death. I don't want to be smart. I want to be pretty, replied Betty teasingly. I can't understand why you are so obstinate about it. I am just trembling like a leaf, said Lois. Ho, why dost thou shiver and shake, Gaffer Gray, and why does thy nose look so blue? Sang Betty provokingly. Now come, arrange my hair, that's a good girl, and don't worry about the Latin part of it. You'll see. Yes, I'll see you fizzle. Well, if you do, I'll die of mortification. I almost quarreled with Jessie Bentworth last evening over it all. They are just dying to have you fail. Indeed, this certainly seems to be a very grave occasion, judging by the condition you are all in, and Betty laughed. Nevertheless, in spite of her indifferent manner, she awaited the hour with impatience. She had challenged Miriam to a reading before the girls of their own table only, but as that had been prevented by Miss Greene, the result was that the first Virgil class would be practically a duel between the two before the whole school, which, as Betty recognized, would vindicate her all the more completely. There was an air of expectation throughout the school, for word of the challenge had spread among the pupils, and they were all agog to see the impertinent new girl put down. Even Miss Payne, ignorant of the cause, felt the suppressed excitement when she came into the main schoolroom, where, on a slight elevation, the Latin class recited. If it had been in one of the smaller classrooms, the contest would have been witnessed by few. Now, however, every girl in the school would see Betty's discomfiture, for it was generally believed that she had boasted unwarrantably at the table, and that her meager acquirements would soon be evident to all. Even those who were unfriendly to Miriam stood by her, and wished her luck in her recitation. Lois, whose seat was near the rostrum where she could hear every word, was white with excitement. At first, Betty was not anxious, for her cousin did not seem half as terrifying as her strict father, but when the recitation had actually begun, she had something akin to stage fright. She herself became like poor Gaffer Gray, though it was not apparent to the onlookers, except by her extreme paleness. Mary Livingstone was the only girl acquainted with the whole story who was neutral. What Betty had said seemed to be pure boasting, yet the evident truth and reliability of the new girl puzzled her, and she decided to withhold judgment until after the recitation. She was eagerly alive to the excitement of the contest, and pushed her books aside to listen more at ease. Even the usually indifferent Dorothy King could not keep fascinated eyes from the Virgil class, and she and Mary whispered, and looked, and whispered again. Some of the pupils in the rear of the room took seats farther front in order to hear better, and others actually stood up when the recitations began. A strange, tense, breathless silence filled the room. Several girls had recited more or less indifferently, and the feeling of impatience was growing more intense when Miss Payne called on Miriam to recite. "Now," said Betty to herself, "we'll see what that girl knows about it," and she watched her eagerly. The eyes of the listeners shifted from Miriam to Betty and back to Miriam, watching to see how Betty was taking Miriam's reading. With her closed book on her lap, her forefinger keeping the place, Betty sat like a marble statue, though her heart sounded to her like a bass drum. "I don't believe she can read it at all, for she isn't even looking into her book," whispered Caroline to Jessie, who was mockingly watching Betty. Nothing but sheer stupidity could make a girl act so, they thought. As was Miriam's custom, she stumbled and stuttered through the lines, though on this day she did better than usual because of the help she had received. She knew the whole school would be watching the contest, and at the end she sat down with something of a flourish, for she had outdone herself. Miss Payne suggested some changes in her translation, adding, "You did unusually well today, Miriam. That is a good beginning for the new school year." Little suspecting how much she contributed to the dramatic action of the moment, Miss Payne next called on Betty, who sprang up, tossing her hair back from her forehead, and prepared to read. At the sound of her clear, sweet voice, necks were craned eagerly, and every eye was fastened on her. She stood there, a slight, graceful girl in a simple white piqué dress, her face almost as white as the dress, in contrast with which the dark, beautiful eyes appeared the more remarkable. Her thick flaxen hair was parted in the middle, and hung in the round head style worn by much younger girls, an arrangement that gave a sweetness and a distinction to her face that was not lost on the pupils, and made Miss Payne start with surprise. In her belt was a large red rose, stuck there at the last moment by Lois, and unnoticed by Betty until she was in the class. As she read, the blood came back to her cheeks, and her interested expression showed that in the lines she loved she had forgotten the hostile, critical faces around her. She read through the long lesson without a single correction from her teacher, her voice clear and melodious, as if rendering sweet and familiar music. When she had finished, Miss Payne exclaimed enthusiastically, "Excellent! That is one of the best translations I have ever heard. It shows your father's thorough training. Dr. Baird is one of the great Latin scholars of our country," she explained to the girls, "and I believe that his daughter's example will be an inspiration to you all." "Thank you, Miss Payne," said Betty, and turning slightly, she added, "I have read 4 books of Virgil," and she looked deliberately and haughtily at Miriam. Great was the excitement in the schoolroom when she sat down, and such was the buzz of conversation that Miss Payne was compelled to ring her bell sharply for order. Jessie Bentworth leaned over to Miriam and asked wickedly, "Shall we snicker, Miriam?" Miriam only scowled in reply. When Betty went to her room after school, Lois jumped up from her chair to meet her, threw her arms around her, and hugged her ecstatically. "Oh, it was glorious, glorious! I am so proud I don't know what to do." "Ho, where's Gaffer Gray now?" asked Betty. "Oh, do sit down now, Betty, and don't walk around like a caged lion while I tell you everything," begged Lois, unable herself to keep still for a second. "Every girl in that room listened. You should have seen them. Mary Livingstone clapped softly when you finished and said, 'I see she knew what she was talking about,' and she and Miss King nodded and laughed when Orpheus made such a fizzle, and I heard Dorothy say you were mighty pretty." "Oh, no, she didn't mean me," exclaimed Betty, deprecatingly. "Yes, she did, and Mary nodded and said, 'She makes some of the girls look like paper dolls.' Oh, you were so splendid. You look tall." "Tall? Did I really?" she exclaimed, highly flattered. "Well, anyhow, I'm glad it's over." "I wonder how Miriam feels now?" asked Lois triumphantly. "Oh, I guess she feels like that young lady of Niger who smiled as she rode on a tiger. They came back from the ride with the lady inside and the smile on the face of the tiger." The girls were laughing merrily together when Mary Livingstone came in to speak of the Latin episode and warmly congratulate Betty on her triumph. Facetiously patting her on the head, after the custom of the Reverend Seniors, she said, "Good child! Good work!" And the two new girls felt truly initiated. End of chapter 8. Recording by Holly Jensen.